Hello, beautiful human beings. Welcome back to the Ryan Magic Show. I've got a treat for you in today's episode. I'm going to be debriefing a conversation that I had, a 90-minute, 2-hour conversation with a very embodied Buddhist monk. And I essentially gave a car ride to a monk and asked him a series of questions about the difficult topics of life. I asked about money. I asked about power. I asked about free will versus predeterminism. And I asked a bunch of other questions. And in this episode, I'm going to be sharing the biggest nuggets that he gave to me in terms of the wisdom that he's cultivated after being a monk for a couple of decades, roughly. So before we jump into this episode, I'd love to invite you guys into understanding what I offer at the moment. So the main thing that I'm putting out there to the world is teaching Vedic meditation. And so if you have been wanting to deepen on your journey of growth, whether it's the healing path or you want to be more fulfilled in your life or you want to accomplish more in life, there is a practice that for me has been most powerful, more powerful than any other practice that I've ever done, and that is Vedic meditation. That's why I went to India for 3 months, to become a Vedic meditation teacher. So although I have a signature 3-day workshop called The Art of Fulfillment, which I'd also highly recommend if someone wanted to squeeze the juice out of what I can offer you, would be to do that as well. But the most foundational piece is Vedic meditation. And so if you're ready to take your life to the next level, you can find out more. Just shoot me a message at the Ryan Magic on Instagram, or you can email me about it, ryan@ryanmagic.com. Okay, let's get into today's episode. So there is a bunch of different ways that you can call monks. And I just wanted to take a moment to honor the Buddhist Society of Victoria for playing a really crucial part in my journey and evolution over the last couple of years as I've been attending their talks and meditations. And I haven't actually been since I've been back from India, as I've been living a bit further away. But I've just had the most incredible opportunity to learn through selfless service from monks by giving them lifts. So I've done this a bunch of times where in order to try to give back, because they don't charge for any of their meditations, everything's donation based. And so the community finds different ways to offer. A lot of the time that comes in the form of money or food that gets given to the monks so they can survive. And one thing that's felt really the most awesome way I can give is by giving them lifts from their city center, community center that's close to the city. And then they also have a monastery that's out in the country, a couple of hours drive away from Melbourne, 90 minutes to 2 hours. And it was so crazy because the other day on the weekend, I was running a retreat, and I was talking to the participants of the retreat about some of the wisdom that I'd gleaned from chatting with these monks. And I hadn't thought about it. I hadn't spoken about it much. It just randomly popped through in the teachings I was giving. And as I was sharing that, I was also in the mind of one of the head monks for the Buddhist Society of Victoria, who messaged me, that I found out a couple of hours later when I checked my phone, asking if I could give a monk a lift on Monday morning. And I finished the retreat on Sunday night. So I was like, yeah, absolutely. I really followed the thread because it was a huge synchronicity. I hadn't spoken to them or heard from Ajahn Nisarano for more than 6 months. And he happened to message me at the exact same time I was talking about them. So followed the thread and then ended up giving a lift to Buntai Jason. And, or again, there's different ways that monks can be referred to. In the Thai tradition, they're all called Ajahn. So Ajahn Nisarano, who is just the most beautiful man, is one of the head monks at this Buddhist Society of Victoria. But then this other monks from Sri Lanka that I chatted with yesterday, and they don't get called Ajahn. So Buntai Jason, or Venerable, what was his other name? Venerable Jinasiri, and very, very wise man, very, very embodied, and has an incredible life story. And so in this episode today, I'm going to be debriefing some of the biggest wisdom bombs that he dropped in our conversation when I was giving him a lift yesterday. So before going directly into that wisdom, I just want to name that I've received some powerful transmissions from these monks. And it's a whole way of being that's very, very different. As I've been exploring more of different wisdom traditions, different lineages, and also different religions over the last couple of years and studying them, including the Rainbow Light lineage, studying Buddhism, studying Judaism, studying Christianity, studying all sorts. We look at the behind me here. I've even got the Quran sitting here. So I've been doing a fair bit of research and just understanding the deep wisdom that threads through all these amazing ascended masters like the Buddha and Christ, and also just the wisdom that these traditions have embodied for such a long period of time. And I've received so much from the unique way of being of these monks who have made a decision to give up their entire normal material reality and become a sannyasi, which is what it's referred to in India, which means a recluse. So no longer am I a normal member of society where I have a relationship and I have a bank account with money and a car and a house. I'm now a hermit, essentially, and they give up a lot and live a very minimalist life so they can connect to the purity of the divine. And it's a very spiritual path, and it fosters a state that can't be accessed as easily unless one is living in those conditions of that lifestyle and that environment, where they get up very early each day, meditate. They essentially just meditate, eat once a day, learn about spirituality, and teach about spirituality. That's all they do. And as I've been on this journey for meditating for a little over 7 years, probably averaging 90 minutes to 2 hours a day for that time period of meditation, the perspective of how I view life is incomparable to before I started that journey, because the state of consciousness through which I view life is completely different. And I know you know what I'm talking about because I know you're on a similar journey and you don't see life the same way that you did 5 years ago. And it's safe to assume that you or I don't have the same level of insight as what someone would who had been meditating almost full time for 20, 30, 40 years. And so there are certain perspectives that can't just be gotten by reading a book, because if you read the book, you're interpreting it through the state of consciousness that you're in, and therefore you're not able to fully extract the wisdom that can only be extracted from the state of consciousness of someone that has practiced a lot more spiritually. So just wanted to pre-frame that because I just feel grateful for these transmissions, and I really hope you open your mind up to some of the perspectives that I'll share in this episode, even though they can be a little bit, I'm going to say, different, a little bit confronting compared to the way that the average person lives in society. And I know that's another reason why you're listening to this episode, because you're curious and open and look at things differently. You like to challenge the status quo and open your mind to living a life that is deeply fulfilling and and really meaningful. And so just wanted to share that. And also that I'm going to focus on the wisdom topics that I spoke to Buntai Jason about yesterday in this episode. But I've spoken to a lot of monks and done a lot of learning from the Buddhist tradition, which has a lot of overlaps with the Vedic tradition. But just speaking directly and having conversations directly with a lot of Buddhist monks has been so valuable. Anyway, I've written down a few pieces to talk about and address directly, and I've got some notes here so I can keep it more orderly and contained. So I want to set the scene for Buntai Jason, give a little bit of an insight to his story, just to honor that story and give some context to where his wisdom has come from. So Buntai Jason's 44 years old. At 5 years old, he realized that most of the people that he was around and saw weren't very happy. He believes that in this lifetime, it wasn't his first lifetime being a monk, and so he was able to catch on to some things pretty quickly, but nevertheless experimented with some more material lifestyles. Growing up in an Asian family, but in Sydney, he ended up becoming a lawyer. I'm guessing a lot of that was influenced by that desire from his family to become secure and successful in a profession like that. But then not too long after that, he realized even more deeply that in order to be truly happy, he's going to have to look at people that model that happiness with a little bit more power. And he then essentially started seeking to learn more about Buddhism. And in his 20s, was ordained into a Buddhist monastery in Sri Lanka, which from his research, the thing that motivated him to want to go to Sri Lanka was that the preservation of the wisdom was strong, meaning that the practices, traditions, and wisdom, the type of Buddhism that was being practiced in Sri Lanka was the closest to what the Buddha actually taught. So it was the most pure form of Buddhism from his perspective. And so he's not really a member of the Buddhist Society of Victoria. It was his first day going there, the day before I picked him up. So he has the experience of learning from people in Sri Lanka and then being very devoted to his study of Buddhism in his own time and history. He had a very powerful understanding of religious history, cultural history, and anthropology in a way. And I love all those topics. So it was a really, really cool foundation of wisdom that he was sharing from. But also the thing that I thought was very, very cool and unique was the way that he actually lives at the moment, because he lives in Sri Lanka in a mud hut that he's made out of mud. Like it's a simple dwelling where he lives in the middle of a jungle where there's only local villages around. He learnt the Sri Lankan local dialect and language so that he can actually teach to local villagers. So 5 days a week, he'll go from one village. They'll give him some food for his one meal a day. He'll then go to another village and share some more wisdom and then be fed. And then the next day he'll go to the next village, be fed and share some wisdom. And there's that exchange, that reciprocity in relationship from the Buddhist tradition, which I find really beautiful, actually, because there's this more of a humble symbiosis, a humble relating dynamic that's not just because I, for example, am very self-sufficient. I make my money. I can choose to do what I want to do. And I'm in a very strong financial position. I don't need anybody financially. And I'm kind of exaggerating that stance of what it's like to be a lone wolf, very sovereign, modern individual. Whereas in Buddhism, the monks aren't allowed to own money, cars. That's why they need to get a lift from me. They don't go get their own food with their own money. They can only receive food, and it creates this beautiful openness to receive, and also this willingness for people in the public to give. And it bridges the gap between these recluses, these monks that live separate from society, to welcome and invite people that are householders living a normal life embedded in society to have a connection and a relationship, and for people to learn from the monks, essentially. So anyway, he lives in nature. He lives from off the water that's from the fresh mountain water where he lives. All of these local villages give organic, fresh food they've grown themselves. He essentially owns probably less than 10 items and just has those items and then can go wherever he wants. It's a very, very interesting way of life. And so he'll wake up anywhere from 3 to 5 a.m., meditate for 2 to 3 hours, go connect with other monks and do some learning together, some chanting together, then teach throughout the day, and then there's more meditation and early night. It's a very simple lifestyle, and it's very pure. And he's been doing this for a very, very long period of time, also involving a lot of study and research. So that's a little piece of context, and that creates a certain ability to cognize, download, cognize, intuit wisdom, or to feel the truth of wisdom. It's that Greek word or Latin word gnosis, Gnosis, gnosis. And that means to know something at a feeling level versus just knowing something intellectually. Like, I can read a book. I've always been further ahead intellectually than I've been in my own personal embodiment, because I've got a sharp intellect. That's not always the most supportive thing. When ancient rishis, which are ancient spiritual devotees of ancient India, for example, the person that that created Vedic meditation, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, created the technique that we practice in Vedic meditation. His guru, Gurudev, Swami Brahmananda Saraswati, left home, 7 years old, decided he wanted to be a recluse, sought out a master that had never engaged in sexuality, had been celibate for life, who had been able to transcend anger in this lifetime. And someone that had a lot of deep wisdom that he felt that he could learn from. He's doing this at 7, 8 years old, finds a master, and then spends a bunch of time learning from his master, and then ends up spending a solid 70-year chunk of his life mainly meditating in the wild, in caves. And then he cognizes wisdom, gives it to Maharishi, teaches Maharishi everything that he knows, and then Maharishi shares Vedic meditation, transcendental meditation with the world, which are different legal practices, but a very similar technique. So anyway, that's what can happen when someone's more purely connected, because they have such a refined sense of what truth is, truth coming from an unchanging, infinite source. This is what Joe Dispenza talks about with the quantum field. This is what Eckhart Tolle talks about with the witness. This is what Muji talks about in terms of infinite freedom, timeless love. Most spiritual people talk about this as oneness versus the ego. It's a very different flavor to the wisdom that comes from that state of the absolute divinity, oneness, etc., versus something that's made up logically from the intellect and the ego. So anyway, pretty much saying that Jason's wisdom's pretty next level, because it's a beautiful combination of both feeling-based knowings and studying Buddhism for a long time. So anyway, let's get into this. The master of pre-framing, as you guys know. So the first thing that I want to talk about actually is the power of detachment. Now, this is something that I've been very aware of, and the wisdom that I teach, the integrative wisdom that I initially called the core method, core being the Latin root word of courage, which means heart, and that foundational premise behind all this big body of wisdom that I contained and structured, the core method, the foundation behind it is that we can live in our heart or we can live in our head. Heart is what enables us to live a fulfilling, free life, and living in the head is survival-based, and it leads to suffering. And one of the big topics that I spoke to Buntai Jason about in our car ride was the power of non-attachment, detachment. And I'm going to do a combination of sharing the wisdom that he shared around this topic and the notes that I have here, but also just riff on it because it's something that I've spoken a lot about and believe in wholeheartedly. And it was just very affirming from another layer to hear it from him and witness it and experience it from him in the way that he lives his life. Now, let's just get out on the table that if someone is attached to anything, it means that they're afraid. Now, this is not a bad thing. It's just a fact. If someone is attached, let's say you're attached to your relationship, it's because you're afraid that your life's going to be worse without it, or you're afraid that you're not going to meet somebody else, or you're afraid of getting it wrong, or you're afraid of being teased and being a failure. If you're attached, you can be very devoted and committed, but not attached. So attachment doesn't mean, the idea of non-attachment doesn't mean don't have anything. It just means the ability to feel whole without these things, so that your livelihood and state of being and sense of self-worth isn't tied to specific job titles, financial positions, relationship statuses, etc. That's what non-attachment is about, being able to feel completely whole with very little. And this is the foundation behind so many different spiritual lineages. A lot of initiations are about the transition. Boys to men in tribes is about non-attachment. There is a wild practice in some of the Mayan traditions. Firstly, there's sweat lodge, and then there's nature sits, where you essentially do, whenever I want to remember a specific name, my mind is just a master of forgetting. Oh, what's it called? Who cares? When you're going out there sitting in nature, fasting and not moving within a perimeter of 3 square meters or whatever it is, 9 meters squared, is essentially a little perimeter. Going out, sitting and not doing anything. No water. So it's fasting from water and from food for a period of time. And that's level 1 within some tradition, within the Mayan tradition. You can go do this nature sit. And it's learning to detach, because what don't you have? You don't have the reliance on the food. You don't have the reliance on the water. You don't have reliance on the comforts from home, of the pillows and the blankets and the bedding and the shelter. You're just out there in the elements, and all you've got is yourself. And that's all you've got to rely on. And that's learning detachment. Yeah, little pilgrimage, initiation rituals. Then if you ramp it up within the same tradition, not in all aspects of Mayan culture, Central South American culture, but in some tribal initiation processes, there's also something called a sun dance, which is gruesome. So little pre-frame / warning for this ritual, which is pretty nasty if you don't want to listen to it. maybe skip forward a minute. But essentially it's called a sun dance. And what happens is there's a tree or a pole in the middle of the desert. And you're out in the open sun. No food, no water. And there is a rope with a hook. There's 2 hooks actually. And these 2 hooks are put in through the chest. Fish hooks, like you're baiting up a fishing line hook. And then someone has to dance with these hooks in their chest in the sun and be able to dance to the point that they rip the hooks out of their chest, and then they've completed the initiation. So there's this detachment from the body to be able to go beyond, to be able to feel the pain and move beyond that pain. Very intense ritual. But it's about practicing detachment. And there is, in things that are repeated culturally from different cultures, and there's overlap, we can see, okay, what's going on here? Because then what happens with someone sits ayahuasca? They fast beforehand. What are they doing? They're purifying by removing their detachments. And so in this world, when the short-term gratification runs rampant and most people are in this hypnotic pattern of scrolling, emotionally eating, then watching Netflix, then so busy and fatigued, they're waking up with an alarm, which means their body's not giving them enough rest, and then they're sedating with coffee that's keeping them on a high. There's all these little different bits and pieces, practices, habits, addictions that cause them to stay sedated. Whereas these are all attachments. What happens when we remove all the attachments and we can actually be okay to thrive without these short-term gratification pieces? Well, freedom, essentially. So this first topic that we're talking about here, Jason was saying that from a young age, he was looking for the answer to happiness, and he found it in disciplining the mind and going on the spiritual path to find freedom. And that discipline led to freedom. The discipline of a monk is that they're not allowed to have sex anymore. They don't have relationships. They don't eat food whenever they want to eat them. They've only got one item of clothing. They shave their head. So all these forms of essentially the 7 deadly sins are pretty much gone. Greed, gone. Gluttony, gone. Sloth, gone, because they've got to practice spiritually every single day for hours, learn, and they've got to do seva. They've got to spread the word of Dharma to those that are show worthy inquiry, people that come to the monastery. They teach them spiritual wisdom. So sloth, gone. Lust, gone. What else? They're pretty much all gone. So all these addictions, all these ways that the devil gets in, from the Bible's perspective, it's not actually the Bible. It was a 500 AD, a specific priest created the 7 deadly sins as a bit of a summary of what he read from the Bible. But the idea is that if you do these sins cause you to move back into ignorance, back into hell. You sin, you go to hell, but it's not necessarily you're going to burn in hell for eternity. It's more that if you sin, which in its Greek origin of the word sin from the Bible, that's kind of got a specific connotation when we read it in English, and what we've learnt, you're a sinner, sin. It's got this real negative connotation, but what it actually just means is to miss the mark in its original definition. So anyway, monks, 7 deadly sins, gone. So therefore their ability to get tempted by the devil, it's gone. And therefore they're living free of that. And from all the monks that I've interviewed, just that I've had conversations with by driving around and been to their talks and asked them questions, and the thread that's been common and gone through everything is that they all love freedom. The freedom is what they're on the search for, and freedom is what they love most about being a monk. And that's so contradictory, because the association that I would have if I was to give up, I'm not allowed to have sex. not allowed to have money. How am I meant to be free if I'm not even allowed to have money, if I've got to give up all these things? How's that freedom? But in that cloud of hypnosis and that trance-like state that most people get in with all their attachments, where they're constantly being knee-jerked around and reacting to these impulses, that's being purified, that's being transcended, and they can actually be in a state where there's contentment for who they are and where they are. And from that foundation, freedom emerges and the capacity to have free will. Because free will doesn't really exist beyond that. If you are, for example, if you're attached to making a certain amount of money, then you can't just make decisions for what's going to be most aligned for you if you're attached to a certain amount of money, because the only options that are available are ones that meet that attachment. If you're attached to being in a relationship, but what's most aligned for you is to be single at that time or to be in a different relationship, if that attachment is ruling you from a place of fear, you don't really have the freedom, the free will to choose what's going to be most fulfilling for you. It's going to be most aligned for you. And this is where we can get trapped with all these attachments that most people have. So that's my little rant on attachment. But I just wanted to summarize that by saying that attachment always comes from the fear of death, because everything that we are afraid of, fear, comes from our nervous system and our amygdala, and it's flashing out warnings. You're going to die. And everything that we feel really afraid of and we avoid is because we think that it might decrease our chance of survival. Okay? And everything that we attach to, we think is going to increase our chance of survival. But it's impulsive from the fear center of the brain, from the amygdala. So I'm not going to go too much deeper into that, but that's the pre-frame. And naming that, what Jason was saying is that, and he didn't say this directly, but what he gathered from the conversation is that monks essentially have the power, and across history have tended to have a relationship with political authorities and leaders of great power. There will be the spiritual folk, the magicians, the priests, the pundits, the rishis, the medicine men and women, the shamans, that will consult the leaders of the tribe, the kingdom, the country, whatever it is. And the role, therefore, of the monks, for example, as people that are pure, they're not attached. So they're free from these desires, these attachments that of the ego that pull people to act out of integrity. If someone lies, they lie because they're afraid that if they tell the truth, it's going to be worse for their survival. They're scared of rejection, scared of going to jail, scared of being tortured. Whatever the situation is, people will lie if they think that it's going to increase their chance of survival. So if a monk is free from attachments because they've purified themselves and they've let go of all these things, they're playing a role. And this is what Jason was talking about that is missing from modern day society, is that we don't have trustworthy, embodied, purified beings, people, monks, to hold political leaders accountable, where the political leader can go to the monks. And these are people that have devoted their life to a life of dharma, which means honor, integrity, right action. The people that have devoted their lives to that, and they've decided to go beyond greed, lust, power, money, and just go, no, I want to feel pure. I want to live a spiritually sound life because I feel like that's what's going to be most aligned for me. Those people can communicate without any bias because their desire is freedom. They don't want to make specific deals with the political authorities to get more money because they don't want the money. The money is something that tempts them, that holds them captive, that keeps them tied to their ego and is a wall between them and the freedom that they seek. And that is, in Sanskrit, moksha. It's beyond incarnation. It's eternal life. And that comes from living a spiritually pure life. So imagine like Donald Trump having to speak to a monk and seeking counsel, and the monk, who isn't even afraid of death, isn't afraid of being killed by Trump, isn't afraid of not getting the money that he hopes he gets tipped by Trump, but it's literally just there, seeing things very purely, very clearly, because not clouded by their own attachments, and being able to say to Trump, you're all over the shop, mate. You're missing this specific way of being that's going to be best for the people, this particular way that's going to be best for the people. You've got to pull yourself in order, and to be able to trust that counsel, because there's a relationship of respect. And so I'm going to tell a little story here that illustrates this point. Detachment at its most powerful form is being able to move beyond the fear of death. And that's what non-attachment or detachment looks like. I'm actually beyond my fear of death, and therefore I'm able to look life in the eyes and make the dharmic decisions, the honorable, aligned decisions that are best for the greater good, that are made from the heart. And there's this story, that's a Zen Buddhist story that I read in a book recently, of a samurai clan that was pillaging a specific village. And a couple of samurais went to the monastery of that village, and there was a Buddhist monk there who was meditating in the gardens, and the monk noticed that they got there and was looking at these samurais that were making their way towards him. And then the samurai, in his whole power quest, and raises his sword and looking at the monk in the eyes, and then the monk's not reacting. And so the samurai warrior says, "Monk, do you know that I have the power to kill you right now? I've got the ability to lop off your head without even thinking about it." And then the monk looks up at the samurai warrior and says, "Well, I have the power to let you lop off my head without even, not the power. I have the ability to let you lop off my head, cut off my head without even thinking about it." And then the samurai warrior was like, "Well," reacting to the fact that this guy's not afraid of death. So I've got the ability to let you kill me without even thinking about it. Samurai, and the Buddhist monk has kind of startled the samurai warrior, who drops his sword. And then while he's got his sword dropped, the Buddhist monk says, "Wow, look at how weak you are." And then the samurai warrior puts his sword back up, and as he raises his sword again in anger, the Buddhist monk points at the samurai warrior and says, "That's hell," insinuating that the experience he has is hell, of being in that anger. And then he, again, being thrown or startled by this wisdom, he drops his sword. And then the monk says, "And that's heaven." And then the samurai drops his sword altogether and bows to the Buddhist monk, realizing that there's much that he can learn from him. And this is an example or a story of the power that comes from non-attachment. And it's a legitimate embodied place that people that have gone further enough on their spiritual path get to, where they're not afraid of death. They're not afraid of death because they see beyond the physical, beyond the material, and they understand the deeper truths of the universe. And so that's a powerful person, because, again, the person that's not afraid of death is able to be free from attachment, and therefore are able to make really pure life decisions. If people are scared, that's when, but a very powerful quote by Tony Robbins is that people will go against their values to meet their needs. If people value honesty, but their need for safety is being compromised, like you're about to be tortured, you will say what you have to say to get out of that situation. And because your need for safety is being compromised, that the value for honesty is less important in that situation. So people will go against their values. I want to be a good person, a kind person. But if I'm feeling misunderstood and insignificant in this argument with my partner, if I'm feeling insignificant and my need for significance is not being seen or acknowledged in this argument, I'm not going to be kind. I'm going to be mean. I'm going to fight back and defend myself because my need for significance is being compromised. Therefore, I'm feeling unsafe ultimately. So we all know, we all have a value to be kind people, but for most of us, there's still times where we get in disagreements and say things that maybe we wouldn't have said if we were in a clear headspace, right? So someone that's been able to go beyond fear, which the ultimate fear is a fear of death, people that have been able to get beyond that have an enormous amount of power in life because they've got the ability to choose what they really want to do. And they feel completely content and whole without all of these external aspects to modern life that most people get trapped in. And it's not that there's anything wrong. And we're going to get to this because I'm going to talk about money, which is another big topic that this monk spoke about, that we had a long discussion about. But at this stage of the chat, understanding that freedom and power come from non-attachment. And people become very weak when their attachments rule them. This is where you get someone that can have a lot of political influence, can have a lot of status in society. Maybe they're a celebrity, but they need the external gratification, the validation. And so they find themselves taking drugs. They find themselves looking for more and more hits of significance. And they're absolutely trapped by it. I found this myself, absolutely trapped by it. There were times where I had worked so much in my business. I already had more than enough money. And I was working so much in my business because I was so desperately attached to the growth and getting ahead and going bigger because I was feeling unworthy where I was, that I couldn't even give myself time off, which was what was needed for my health, because I'd had migraines for a whole year, every single day. And my meditation teacher at the time, right towards the end of that chapter of my life, where I was more driven in business and attached to the significance and the success and the achievement from business to feel worthy. And my meditation teacher said, take a week off. I challenge you. That's a homework task. And I was like, no way am I going to take a whole week off. I'd pretty much declared that I would never have more than 3 days off because I wanted to win. I wanted to win this game of life, to do everything that I could to be the most successful person I could possibly be, to make the most of every opportunity to thrive in life externally, out of the fear that I get to the end of my life and die with regrets. And there's this constant inner critic saying, you're not good enough, you're not good enough. And so I had what a lot of people in society would say is fantastic success, but I was completely a prisoner to my own insecurity, completely a prisoner to my own attachment. So I didn't have free will. I couldn't just choose what I wanted to do. Couldn't choose if I wanted to eat this food, or what if it's not healthy enough? And then I would end up binge eating because I'd be so shameful or feel so much pressure that I just was in such a state of distress internally I wouldn't say that I was stressed, but I was just short-term gratification, overworking, short-term gratification, headaches, adrenal fatigue, all this crazy stuff. That's not freedom because I didn't have choice. I was reactive to my patterns. I was reactive to my fears and insecurities. Essentially, I was in attachment. And that's where the power that comes from detachment, because someone can feel unconditionally whole with who they are and where they are. And that really is the energy of the king or queen energy, where someone can feel whole in who they are. They've been able to navigate their attachments to the point that then there's enough fullness there, enough love there, that they can be of service to others. So, firstly, the power that monks carry. And it was funny because I was being vulnerable about my existing attachments to money. I still have a lot of attachments to money. And I'm in a very powerful financial, let's not exaggerate, get on my high horse too much, but I'm in a very strong financial situation to the extent that my passive income exceeds my expenses. And so that's a pretty solid position, but yet I'm still affected by how much am I going to make from this workshop? What should I price this at? I'm not fully clean and exempt from pressure that comes from finances that doesn't match the situation, meaning that I can be overwhelmed or anxious about a decision around money when it doesn't actually have any repercussions on my livelihood. But there are still trappings there for me. And I was talking to this monk about it. And it was funny. He was like, well, the Buddha had he had no money because he refused to receive money. And that's the model that he demonstrated and the way that he got all monks to be from that point on. Buddhist monks don't keep personal money. So he said the Buddha didn't have any money, and he wasn't a loser. And he's got a pretty solid point. He was a very revered, respected, honorable man of his day that had a humongous influence. One of the most influential, it's become a religion now, but ways of being in the whole world right now. And he didn't have any money. Jesus was the same. Jesus didn't believe in money. He said that you've got more chance of getting a camel through the eye of a needle than being a rich man and going to heaven. And exaggerating the point that if you're so caught up in your desire to have more money than what you need, then you're kind of held captive by it. All right. That's enough on this. Detachment equals freedom is essentially the point that we're going to get to. And being attached means that you're scared. And if you're scared, you're not very powerful. So let's go to the next point. And I know this is a confronting topic because we all have attachments and we're all put in front of situations that magnify these attachments because the whole way we've been taught to operate in society and what we've been told is good and noble and celebration worthy is a lot around status, it's a lot around money, it's a lot around power, success, etc. And these are all therefore become attachments. So it's difficult. I'm not saying that this is what you should do, but just want to honor the truth of where it sits, that attachment means that you're held captive by fear. Doesn't mean you can't have the things you're attached to, or like some of these topics like money, power, etc. You can still have a lot of power and not be attached to it. You still have a lot of money and not be attached to it. But to the degree to which you are attached is the degree to which you are scared, and the degree to which you are scared compromises your capacity to be of integrity. Okay, so let's move forward. The next thing that I want to talk about is the discussion that I had with the monk around money. And I was approaching him. It was a good segue from the past, the last thing that I was talking about with his advice to me around money. You know what? I feel like I'm going to actually pause this whole interview here because it's been going for 49 minutes so far. And I'm going to do a part 2. So this is a very, very important topic that we went through in today's interview around detachment, power, and what freedom really looks like. Freedom and power actually looks like. And if someone actually, the way that we look at monks, though, it's so confronting for us to be in a position of getting rid of all attachments that it's almost like a joke or anything that we think is weird. Like it's weird to live without possessions. Anything that we call weird is something that we're confronted by or doesn't feel safe. And most people would say that if you chose to become a monk, that's weird. And that kind of shows where we're at as a society, especially in Australia and America, because in India, It's very normal for people to be sannyasis. 1/5, like there's a caste system that is officially revoked or like formally revoked, but culturally still exists, of these 5 categories of where you can be, what rung of society you exist in. And the highest rung of society is the Brahmin caste. And to be a Brahmin is to be a spiritual person. That's the highest. The merchant card is in the middle. There are the untouchables, which are like outcasts. There are servants, which is second from the bottom, which is anyone that's kind of like working hard and doing action for people, cleaners, cooks, etc. And then there are merchants are next, midway up the hierarchy. Then there are warriors, kshatriya in Sanskrit. And then right at the top are Brahmins. They're seen as the top rung of society. And people that are born into that caste system, born as a Brahmin, it's very, very common for them to become a sannyasi, where they're not a householder. They'll live in an ashram, or they'll live in a temple, or they'll go and live in the mountains. And that's normal. There are householders, and there are sannyasis. And that's just pretty normal. Whereas in Australia, there's not, oh, are you a householder or are you a recluse? Are you a hermit or are you a householder? Everyone's a householder. It's very, very statistically unusual for someone to choose that route. But that doesn't necessarily mean that living with attachment and fully at the mercy of modern comforts doesn't have a implication on our level of fulfillment. And that's what I want you to consider. Imagine if you didn't have attachment to money. Imagine if you didn't have attachment to your status in society. Imagine if you didn't have attachment to your relationship. Imagine if you didn't have attachment to what you ate, your device, all these different things, to sexuality. Imagine if you didn't have attachment. Doesn't mean you couldn't participate in it, but imagine if you didn't have attachment. Very, very, very different way of being. And that's where contentment and fulfillment can start to become more of an experience of life, more of a embodied state of reality. Cool. All right, let's put a pause to the episode here. I'll do another one separately. Love you guys. Thanks for tuning in. If you want to go further, send me a message about learning to become a Vedic meditator, which means that you'll become a twice daily meditator. You'll understand what I believe is the purest form of meditation, transcendence technique, which for me has been nothing more empowering or powerful in my day-to-day life, because it adds up. You're meditating twice a day, every single day. That's over 700 times a year you're meditating. That has a very big impact on your capacity to work through trauma. That has a very big impact on your capacity for presence, for awareness and detaching from things, patterns, negative patterns in your life that hold you captive. It's a very, very, very powerful practice. And once you learn, you can relearn for free for the rest of your life from any affiliated Vedic meditation teachers around the world. Once you're in, you're in. And it's a very supportive network. So highly recommend learning. It's game changing. It costs less than $1,000 to learn. And then you got pretty much a lifetime membership, being able to relearn and go to group meditations for free around the world. It's very, very powerful. So hit me up, ryan@ryanmagic.com on email, or the Ryan Magic on Instagram. Love you guys heaps, and I'll see you in the next episode.